The first rays of dawn painted the presidential palace in Ouagadougou with hues of gold and amber, an ironic foreshadowing of the day that would change the trajectory of Burkina Faso forever. President Ibrahim Traoré had risen early, as was his custom, to review the morning briefings before the capital fully awakened. At 42, Traoré embodied the hopes of a new generation of African leaders, young, educated, and determined to break the cycles of dependency that had plagued his nation since independence. His office, modest by international standards but dignified in its simplicity, overlooked the bustling streets, where vendors were already setting up their stalls. Children walked to school in pressed uniforms, and the daily rhythm of Burkina life unfolded. The morning's agenda appeared routine: reports on agricultural projects in the northern provinces, security updates from border regions where instability in neighboring Mali occasionally spilled over, and diplomatic correspondence from various embassies. But buried among the official documents was something that would shatter 6 decades of carefully constructed lies. The unmarked envelope bore no official seals, no return address, no indication of its extraordinary contents. His secretary, Aminata Kabore, had noted its unusual delivery, handed directly to a government clerk by a European man who had departed immediately without providing identification. Inside, Traoré found a weathered photograph and a handwritten note that would prove to be the first thread in unraveling one of Africa's greatest historical injustices. The photograph, slightly faded but remarkably well preserved, showed a scene from 1960 that had been deliberately erased from official history. French colonial officials in crisp military uniforms stood supervising the loading of wooden crates onto a transport aircraft. The location was unmistakably Ouagadougou's old airfield, now buried beneath a bustling commercial district where teenagers sold phone cards and women hawked colorful fabrics. But it was the handwritten note that made Traoré's pulse quicken. 40 tons of gold taken, not as reparations, but as theft. The documentation exists. The gold exists. 72 hours before the records are destroyed forever. An old debt awaits collection. At the bottom, a sequence of numbers and letters that appeared to be coordinates, followed by a phrase in Moray, the indigenous language that Traoré had learned at his grandmother's knee. The ancestors' blood calls for justice. Traoré studied the photograph with the trained eye of someone who had spent years analyzing intelligence reports. The faces of the French officials showed no guilt or secrecy, just the routine expressions of men conducting what they believed to be legitimate business. Yet if the message was accurate, this photograph documented one of the greatest thefts in Africa's history. The implications were staggering. Burkina Faso, then known as Upper Volta, had been granted independence on August 5, 1960, but had inherited virtually no financial reserves despite decades of gold mining under colonial rule. The official explanation had always been that gold production had been minimal, barely sufficient to cover colonial administrative costs. But this photograph suggested a very different truth. Traoré pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Aminata, please contact Finance Minister Ouedraogo and Security Chief Ouedraogo immediately. Tell them I need to see them within the hour. Mark it as urgent and confidential." As he waited for his advisors to arrive, Traoré walked to the large window that dominated one wall of his office. Below, Ouagadougou was coming to life, motorcycles weaving through traffic, children in school uniforms walking along dusty streets, and vendors arranging their wares under colorful umbrellas. This was the Burkina Faso he governed, vibrant, resilient, but undeniably poor, despite significant natural resources. The irony was not lost on him. If the photograph was authentic, the poverty he witnessed daily was not the result of natural scarcity or African incapacity, as colonial apologists had long suggested, but of systematic theft on an unprecedented scale. Within 30 minutes, his most trusted advisors had assembled in the secure conference room adjacent to his office. Finance Minister Ama Ouedraogo, a brilliant economist who had earned her doctorate at the Sorbonne before returning to serve her homeland, examined the photograph with professional skepticism. Her analytical mind immediately focused on details that could verify or debunk the image's authenticity. "Mr. President," she said carefully, adjusting her reading glasses, "we should approach this with extreme caution. This could be sophisticated manipulation, perhaps designed to create diplomatic tension with France at a particularly sensitive moment in our relationship." Security Chief Michel Ouedraogo, no relation to the finance minister, despite sharing a surname, nodded his agreement. A former military intelligence officer who had trained with French special forces before Burkina Faso's military cooperation agreement was revised, understood the complex web of interests that could benefit from destabilizing Franco-African relations. "The timing is suspicious," he observed, tapping the photograph with a thick finger. "Just as we're renegotiating mining contracts with several international corporations, someone sends you evidence of colonial-era theft. It could be an attempt to pressure us into making concessions or to justify breaking existing agreements." Traore listened to their concerns with the patience that had made him an effective leader. Both advisors were right to be cautious. Burkina Faso's recent assertiveness in demanding better terms from foreign mining companies had already strained relations with France and other former colonial powers. "Valid points," Traore acknowledged. "But consider the alternative. What if this is authentic? 40 tons of gold at today's prices would be worth approximately 2.3 billion euros. That level of capital could transform our entire development trajectory." He pointed to the coordinates written on the note. "This appears to reference a location in Geneva, Switzerland. If someone has gone to the trouble of preserving evidence for over 60 years, storing it in Swiss vaults, we owe it to our people to investigate." Finance Minister Ouedraogo raised an eyebrow. Geneva, the banking capital of Europe. If colonial-era gold was indeed removed from our territory, Switzerland would be a logical place to hide both the treasure and the evidence of its theft. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of historical gaps in their national archives. Despite decades of independence, Burkina Faso's understanding of its pre-independence economic situation remained frustratingly incomplete. Colonial records had either been removed by departing French administrators or remained classified in archives in Paris and other French cities. "We need to verify this discreetly," Traore decided after an hour of analysis. "If colonial officials did systematically remove our national gold reserves, there must be documentation somewhere, either in our archives or in theirs." Security Chief Ouedraogo was already making notes. "I can initiate a careful review of our colonial-era financial records. We should also analyze the photograph for signs of digital manipulation and attempt to trace the envelope's delivery." "And if the evidence proves authentic?" Finance Minister Ouedraogo asked pointedly. Traore's expression hardened slightly. "Then we reclaim what was rightfully ours, not through military means or diplomatic confrontation, but through historical justice. The world has changed since 1960. There are international mechanisms for addressing such grievances if we have sufficient evidence. Within hours, a small team was assembled to investigate the mysterious message. Professor Salif Kabore, the elderly director of Burkina Faso's National Archives, was summoned from his research at the University of Ouagadougou. A respected historian who had spent decades piecing together the fragmented story of his nation's past, Kabore had often wondered about unexplained gaps in the colonial financial records. Dr. Fatou Diallo, one of West Africa's few digital forensics experts, was quietly brought in to analyze the photograph for signs of manipulation. Her laboratory at the National University had recently been upgraded with equipment capable of detecting even sophisticated digital alterations. By evening, the initial findings were presented to Traore in a secure briefing room. Dr. Diallo's analysis was conclusive. The photograph showed no signs of digital alteration and appeared consistent with documented colonial-era photography techniques. The paper stock, the photographic chemicals detected through spectral analysis, even the slight fading patterns, all indicated authentic 1960s-era documentation. More tellingly, Professor Kabore had discovered exactly the type of evidence that lent credibility to the mysterious message. "Mr. President," he explained, opening bound volumes of colonial financial records, "there is indeed a puzzling gap in our national financial archives from the 3 months preceding independence in August 1960. He showed Traore the bound volumes with their telltale missing sections, pages that had been carefully removed, leaving only the binding stubs as evidence of their former existence. What's particularly significant is that the records before and after this period meticulously document gold production, reserves, and transfers. Colonial administrators were obsessive record keepers. The absence of documentation during this crucial period is highly suspicious." Security Chief Ouedraogo's investigation had yielded equally intriguing results. The coordinates in the note point to a specific safety deposit box facility in Geneva, not a traditional bank, but a discreet storage company that caters to clients seeking maximum privacy and long-term security. He pulled up surveillance footage on his laptop. "We've also traced the envelope's delivery. Security cameras captured the European man who handed it to our government clerk yesterday. He appeared to be in his 60s, well-dressed, and moved with the confidence of someone familiar with diplomatic protocols. Unfortunately, facial recognition hasn't found a match in our databases." Traore absorbed this information while weighing his options. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling enough to warrant further investigation. But the decision he was contemplating, traveling to Switzerland to pursue a 60-year-old treasure hunt, would be seen as reckless by many of his advisors. "I need to go to Geneva," he announced, causing both advisors to immediately object. "Mr. President," Finance Minister Ouedraogo protested, "leaving the country on short notice based on an anonymous tip seems extremely unwise. Send diplomatic representatives, or better yet, intelligence operatives who can investigate without creating an international incident." Traore shook his head firmly. "If this is truly about our nation's stolen wealth, it should be recovered by Burkina Faso's elected leader. Besides," he added, picking up the note again, "this message was addressed to me specifically. Whoever sent it expected the president to respond personally." After intense discussion lasting well into the night, a compromise was reached. Traore would travel to Switzerland, ostensibly for a previously unannounced meeting regarding sustainable development initiatives, a plausible cover given his administration's focus on renewable energy and climate adaptation. A minimal security detail would accompany him, maintaining the low profile necessary for discreet investigation. Meanwhile, Finance Minister Ouedraogo would lead a team investigating historical records of colonial-era gold reserves, both through their own archives and through diplomatic channels with France. If the Swiss investigation proved fruitful, they would need comprehensive documentation to support any claims for restitution. "Remember," Traore told his team as the meeting concluded near midnight, "we have less than 72 hours according to this message. If it's legitimate, time is running out. If it's not, we'll have lost little more than a few days of investigation." Before dawn the next morning, Traore boarded a government aircraft with a carefully selected entourage: Security Chief Ouedraogo, a single bodyguard, and 2 diplomatic attachés who could provide cover for the unusual trip. As the plane climbed above the West African landscape, passing over the gold-rich regions that had once filled colonial coffers, Traore found himself studying the mysterious photograph again. The faces of the French colonial officials haunted him. They showed no guilt, no secrecy, just the routine expressions of men conducting what they believed to be legitimate business. Yet, if the message was accurate, this photograph documented the systematic impoverishment of a nation on the eve of its independence. The flight to Geneva provided time for reviewing briefing documents prepared by his staff overnight. Historical gold production in colonial Upper Volta had indeed been significant, with records showing consistent extraction from multiple mining regions. But the official transfer of assets during the independence process made no mention of gold reserves, an omission that had never been seriously questioned by the incoming African government, eager to maintain good relations with France. As the aircraft began its descent into Geneva, Traore contemplated the possibilities ahead. Burkina Faso remained one of the world's poorest nations, despite significant natural resources. If colonial-era gold had indeed been stolen and could be reclaimed, it would represent not just financial redemption, but historical vindication of Africa's capacity for self-governance. The Swiss city greeted them with characteristic efficiency and discretion. A modest diplomatic reception at the airport, arranged through Burkina Faso's small embassy in Bern, was followed by a secure convoy to a boutique hotel in Geneva's Old Town. The medieval streets and ancient buildings created an almost surreal backdrop for their modern quest for historical justice. Within an hour of arriving, Traore, accompanied by Security Chief Ouedraogo and his bodyguard, set out for the coordinates indicated in the mysterious message. The location proved to be in Geneva's financial district, among the discreet buildings that housed some of the world's most secretive banking and storage operations. The building itself was unremarkable, a narrow structure with a marble facade that gave no indication of its purpose. Only a small brass plaque reading Sécurité Discrète SA marked the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed, professional, and slightly intimidating. A receptionist with the neutral politeness characteristic of Swiss financial services greeted them. "Good afternoon. How may we assist you?" "We believe a safety deposit box has been reserved for our access," Traore explained, showing the alphanumeric code from the message. "This matter is both urgent and confidential." The receptionist examined the code with practiced efficiency, then made a discreet phone call in rapid French. Moments later, an elderly man in an impeccable suit appeared from an interior office. His bearing suggested decades of experience handling unusual situations for powerful clients. "President Traoré," he said with a slight bow, "this is indeed most unusual. We typically require advance notice for any diplomatic visits, and our clients' privacy requirements are very strict." "I understand the irregularity," Traore replied carefully. However, the matter is both urgent and relates to historical documentation that may be of significant importance to my nation." Blanc studied him with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to assessing the legitimacy of unusual requests. After a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, he nodded slowly. "The safety deposit box you seek was indeed established with very unusual provisions," he said, consulting a discreet tablet. "It can be accessed only by the sitting president of Burkina Faso upon presentation of the specific code you've provided, and only during a very limited time window." "Which is?" Traore asked, feeling the weight of the mysterious deadline. "According to our records, the box becomes permanently sealed after exactly 72 hours from when the initial notification was delivered to you. That gives you," Blanc consulted his tablet again, "approximately 58 hours remaining." The precision of this timing suggested elaborate advance planning. Someone had orchestrated this revelation to unfold with theatrical drama, ensuring urgency while providing just enough time for proper investigation. Blanc led them through a series of security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last. Biometric scanners, reinforced doors, and surveillance systems that would have impressed intelligence agencies all protected the facility's contents. Finally, they entered a climate-controlled vault room where the walls were lined with safety deposit boxes of varying sizes, each bearing only a number. "Box 1960-081, Blanc announced, stopping before a medium-sized drawer. The date reference was hardly coincidental. 1960, the year of Burkina Faso's independence, combined with what appeared to be a sequential number. "If you would provide the access code," he requested, indicating a digital keypad beside the box. Traore entered the alphanumeric sequence from the message. After a moment of electronic processing, there was a soft click, and the drawer slid open approximately 3 centimeters. "I'll provide you privacy for your examination," Blanc said professionally, stepping back toward the vault entrance. "Please use the consultation room through that door when you're ready to examine the contents in detail." Once alone with the partially opened box, Traore exchanged meaningful glances with Security Chief Ouedraogo. Whatever lay inside could potentially change their nation's future, or prove to be an elaborate hoax that would make them appear foolish on the international stage. With steady hands that betrayed none of his internal tension, Traore pulled the drawer fully open. Inside was a sealed metal container, surprisingly heavy for its size, suggesting contents of considerable density and value. In the privacy of the consultation room, Traore carefully opened the sealed container. Inside, protected by foam padding and moisture-proof wrapping, were 3 items that would prove to be the keys to unlocking 6 decades of hidden history. A USB drive containing digitized documents, a leather-bound journal with yellowed pages bearing the insignia of the French colonial administration of Upper Volta, and a small golden key of distinctly antique design. Security Chief Ouedraogo carefully connected the USB drive to a secure laptop they had brought specifically for this purpose. The device contained hundreds of scanned documents, official colonial records, correspondence between Paris and colonial administrators, and detailed inventories of gold reserves accumulated between 1945 and 1960. Most crucially, it contained bureaucratically worded orders for the strategic relocation of precious metal assets in anticipation of territorial transition, language that masked the planned removal of gold reserves just before independence was granted. But it was the leather-bound journal that provided the human dimension to this historical crime. It belonged to Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a mid-level French colonial administrator who had apparently documented the gold transfer operation with increasing discomfort and meticulous detail. His early entries were routine, describing administrative duties and social events among the colonial community. But as 1960 progressed, the tone became increasingly troubled. April 12, 1960. The scale of the operation becomes clearer daily. 40 tons of gold accumulated from Upper Volta's mines over decades is to be removed without the knowledge of the incoming African government. I expressed concerns about the legality to Commissioner Dubois, who reminded me that technically all assets remain French property until the official independence date. This legalistic view ignores moral reality. Later entries detailed the complex logistics of moving such quantities of gold secretly, including the creation of false documentation claiming much lower historical gold production for the region. The operation required careful coordination between mining sites, transportation networks, and financial institutions in France. June 15, 1960. The last shipments are being prepared. We have systematically removed not just physical gold, but also documentation of its existence. Future African administrators will find records suggesting minimal gold production, making it nearly impossible for them to question what was taken from them. The final entry, dated August 3, 1960, just 2 days before Upper Volta's independence, was the most damning. The last aircraft departed today. The vaults that contained 40 tons of gold accumulated over 15 years of intensive mining are now empty. Commissioner Dubois toasted our successful asset protection. I find I cannot share his satisfaction. History may call this prudent colonial administration. Truth would call it theft. But what troubles me most is the deliberate deception, not just taking the gold, but ensuring the new nation would never know what had been stolen from them. But it was the golden key that presented the greatest immediate mystery. Nothing in the documents explained its purpose, though its antique design and the care with which it had been preserved suggested significant importance. "This evidence is extraordinary," Security Chief Ouedraogo said quietly after they had reviewed everything. "But evidence alone doesn't recover 40 tons of gold. Where is it now?" Traore was studying the key closely, turning it over in his hands and examining the intricate engravings that suggested French craftsmanship from the mid-20th century. Colonial administration would have transferred the gold to Paris initially, but they wouldn't have publicly recorded it as coming from Upper Volta. It would have been absorbed into French national reserves, making it nearly impossible to identify or reclaim decades later. Unless, Ouedraogo concluded grimly, we can prove its specific origin and current location through documentation that the French government would be forced to acknowledge. Perhaps not impossible, Traore said thoughtfully, still examining the key. Mercier clearly had profound regrets about his role in this operation. He documented everything meticulously, preserved the evidence for 60 years, and arranged for it to reach us at a specific time. What if he did more? What if this key leads to additional evidence or documentation? As they carefully repacked the items to remove them from the facility, Traore's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Finance Minister Ouedraogo in Ouagadougou. Colonial Archive Review confirms unusual gaps in financial records. More significantly, discreet inquiries through diplomatic channels about historical gold transfers have triggered unexpected French reactions. Not outright denial, but deflection and sudden diplomatic unavailability. You were right. Something significant happened before independence. This confirmation from Ouagadougou added credibility to Mercier's documentation. If French officials were becoming defensive about historical inquiries, it suggested they had something to hide. Back at their hotel, Traore convened a secure video conference with his team in Ouagadougou. Finance Minister Ouedraogo reported that their discreet inquiries about historical gold transfers had indeed triggered reactions from French officials that went beyond normal diplomatic courtesy. She explained that it's not outright denial, but sudden unavailability for meetings, deflection to other topics, and references to complex historical questions that require careful study. The pattern suggests they know exactly what we're investigating. Professor Traoré had made additional discoveries in the archives. We found hidden correspondence from nationalist leaders in 1960 questioning the whereabouts of gold reserves that mining employment figures suggested should have existed. Their inquiries were dismissed by transitional authorities as accounting discrepancies and misunderstandings of colonial bookkeeping practices. The picture that emerged was of systematic deception that had been successful for 6 decades. The incoming African government, eager to maintain good relations with France and focused on the immense challenges of building a new nation, had never seriously pursued questions about missing gold reserves. Traore shared what they had found in Geneva, the documentary evidence of systematic gold removal, and the mysterious key that might lead to additional revelations. He explained to his team, "The documents confirm the gold was taken to France, but recovering it will be extraordinarily difficult. We would need to prove that specific gold in today's French national reserves originated from our territory 60 years ago, unless Mercier left us more than just historical documentation." Finance Minister Ouedraogo leaned forward on the video screen. "That key must serve some purpose." Mercier was clearly methodical in his documentation and preservation of evidence. He wouldn't have included it without reason. Security Chief Ouedraogo had been analyzing the key's design and markings during the discussion. It's definitely an old-style safety deposit box key, but not of Swiss manufacture. The engravings and metalwork suggest French production, mid-20th century. So we need to find a French bank or storage facility with a 60-year-old safety deposit box, Traoré concluded. But which one and where? They spent the next several hours analyzing the documents and journal entries, searching for any clue about the key's intended use. Finally, Professor Traoré noticed a pattern in Mercier's writing. Look at his references to ensuring partition and divided security, Traoré explained over the video link. I believe he's using coded language because he didn't trust his fellow administrators. What if he deliberately divided the evidence, documentation preserved in Switzerland, but something else hidden in France? Traoré studied Mercier's journal entries again, and noticed that whenever the administrator mentioned partition or division, he also referenced personal visits to Paris, specifically to the Old Quarter, or where scholars gather. The Latin Quarter, Traoré realized suddenly, the intellectual heart of Paris, where the Sorbonne and other academic institutions are located. If Mercier wanted to hide something in Paris, he might have chosen a location that reflected his educational background and personal interests. A search through historical records of banks and secure storage facilities in Paris's Latin Quarter from the 1960s yielded a promising lead. A small private bank that had primarily served academics, writers, and publishing houses, known for its discretion and century-old vault system. Though the institution had been absorbed by a larger financial group in the 1980s, records indicated that its original vault system remained operational for legacy clients who had maintained accounts for decades. "I need to go to Paris," Traoré decided immediately. His advisor's objections were swift and vehement. Finance Minister Ouedraogo's voice carried clear concern even through the encrypted video connection. "Mr. President, entering France with this knowledge creates enormous risk. French intelligence services will certainly be monitoring your movements by now." "Which is exactly why we need a diversion," Traoré replied, his mind already working through the operational details. "Tomorrow, announce publicly that I'll be attending an economic development forum in Brussels, file the diplomatic notifications, prepare the usual advanced security arrangements, make it appear that this Brussels visit is entirely legitimate and planned." Within hours, a carefully orchestrated deception was in motion. While official announcements indicated that President Traoré would be traveling to Brussels for discussions on West African economic development, his actual aircraft filed a flight plan for Luxembourg. From there, he would travel by secure ground transportation to Paris, maintaining complete communications blackout, except through encrypted channels known only to his most trusted advisors. The plan required split-second timing and flawless execution. French intelligence services, alerted by the diplomatic inquiries about historical gold transfers, would certainly be monitoring Traoré's movements. The Brussels diversion would hopefully draw their surveillance away from his actual destination long enough for him to investigate Mercier's second cachet of evidence. Before departing Geneva, Traoré had one final task. He returned to Sécurité Discrète SA and requested a private meeting with Director Blanc. In the facility's discreet office, surrounded by the understated luxury that characterized Switzerland's most exclusive financial services, Traoré posed the question that had been nagging at him. The materials we found were quite illuminating, but I'm curious about the establishment of this box. Who created it and when? Blanc consulted his confidential records, his expression revealing nothing of the extraordinary nature of the inquiry. The safety deposit box was established in 1965 by a French citizen named Jean-Baptiste Mercier. The unusual access provisions limited to the sitting president of Burkina Faso with that specific code were set at that time. Additionally, automatic notification was programmed to be triggered if the box wasn't accessed within 60 years of its creation. This revelation added another layer to Mercier's extraordinary planning. Not content with simply preserving evidence, he had created a system to ensure it would eventually surface, even if he didn't live to see its discovery. "So I'm the first person to access this box?" Traoré asked. "Yes, Mr. President. The notification you received was programmed to be sent to whoever held your office in 2025, exactly 60 years after the box's creation. But this raised another puzzling question. Then why did I receive the notification now in 2020, 5 years ahead of schedule?" Blanc looked genuinely surprised. "I cannot explain that, Mr. President. Our automated systems are highly reliable and wouldn't trigger notifications ahead of their programmed schedule without external intervention." This revelation added yet another mystery to an already complex situation. Someone had deliberately accelerated Mercier's timeline, sending the notification years before it was intended to activate. But who had that capability, and why trigger the revelation now rather than waiting for the planned date? The journey to Paris was tense but successful. Using diplomatic resources from a friendly European nation and traveling under cover of darkness, Traoré and his minimal security detail entered France without detection. By midnight, they had reached the Latin Quarter, its narrow, medieval streets nearly empty except for the occasional late-night wanderer or student returning from evening studies. The former private bank was now a branch of Crédit National, its historic facade carefully preserved while its interior had been modernized to meet contemporary banking standards. A pre-arranged meeting with the night manager, arranged through discreet financial channels with no mention of Traoré's identity, provided access to the original vault area. "These old safety deposit boxes haven't been accessed in years," the manager explained, leading them down marble steps to a subterranean level that felt like a crypt from another era. "We maintain them primarily for historical value and for the handful of legacy clients who insist on using the original facilities." The vault's design was distinctly different from the Swiss facility, less technological, more mechanical, with brass fixtures and ornate metalwork that reflected 19th-century craftsmanship. The atmosphere was heavy with history and secrets accumulated over more than a century of discreet financial services. Traore provided the number engraved on the golden key, and they were led to a corresponding box in the vault's oldest section. When the key turned in the lock with a satisfying mechanical click, the heavy drawer slid open smoothly, revealing a sealed metal tube approximately 1 meter in length. The manager discreetly withdrew, leaving Traore and Security Chief Ouedraogo alone with Mercier's second revelation. Inside the tube, they found a rolled document protected by waterproof coating that had preserved it perfectly for over 50 years. As they carefully unrolled it on an examination table, they found themselves looking at something that would prove even more valuable than the Swiss documentation: a detailed architectural plan of a facility in rural France, annotated with handwritten notes in Mercier's now familiar script. The heading identified it as Réserve d'Or National Site C, one of France's most secure gold storage facilities. Most critically, the plan highlighted a specific section labeled Acquisitions Coloniales 1945 to 1960, with detailed vault numbers, security protocols from the 1960s, and what appeared to be administrative access codes written in the margins. Mercier had provided them with a literal roadmap to the stolen gold's location. But there was more. Attached to the architectural plan was a typed letter on official colonial administration letterhead, addressed to the future leader of Upper Volta, Burkina Faso, and dated January 5, 1965. If you are reading this, then 60 years have passed since I participated in what I came to recognize as a criminal act. The removal of your nation's gold reserves was presented to colonial administrators as financial prudence and legal asset protection. In truth, it was nothing less than theft from a newborn nation that would desperately need those resources for development. The enclosed documents provide both evidence of the theft and the precise location where your gold has been stored. The removed gold was kept segregated within French national reserves, initially from administrative routine, but later, I believe, from unspoken acknowledgement of its questionable legal status. I have spent the decades since independence in quiet service to your people, establishing educational projects and healthcare initiatives in Burkina Faso's rural regions through private foundations, attempting to repay a debt that was never mine alone to bear. This final act of disclosure cannot provide absolution, but perhaps it enables justice. The evidence I have preserved will withstand scrutiny in international courts should legal action become necessary. However, France has changed significantly since 1960, as has the global understanding of colonial exploitation. It is my fervent hope that recognition and restitution can be achieved through honest dialogue rather than confrontation. With profound regret for past actions and hope for future reconciliation, Jean-Baptiste Mercier. The letter was both a confession and a roadmap for recovery, written by a man who had spent his remaining years attempting to atone for his role in systematic theft. He provided everything, Security Chief Ouedraogo said quietly, studying the architectural plans. Not just proof of the crime, but the exact location where the evidence can be found and recovered. Traore was rereading Mercier's letter, struck by the moral courage it must have required to preserve evidence that could have destroyed his career and reputation if discovered during his lifetime. But the most immediate question remains, Traore observed. How do we use this information? We can't simply present ourselves at a highly secure French government facility and demand access to vaults containing stolen African gold. We need leverage, Security Chief Ouedraogo concluded, and for leverage, we need this evidence to be independently verified and legally authenticated before France realizes we possess it. The next few hours were spent in careful preparation. Digital copies of all materials from both Switzerland and France were transmitted through secure channels to trusted legal advisors in multiple countries. The physical documents were entrusted to diplomatic pouches bound for Ouagadougou through routes that would ensure their safety even if Traoré's mission was discovered. As dawn broke over Paris, illuminating the city where centuries of colonial wealth had been accumulated, Traoré made the boldest decision of his presidency. He contacted the office of the French president directly, requesting an urgent private meeting regarding a historical matter of significant importance to both our nations. The unusual request, coming from an African leader who was not officially in France and who had no scheduled diplomatic business, created exactly the confusion and uncertainty that Traoré had calculated. French intelligence services, already aware of inquiries about historical gold transfers, would now be scrambling to understand the full scope of what the Burkina Faso president knew and why he had come to France secretly. By mid-morning, French intelligence had confirmed Traoré's presence in Paris, creating a delicate diplomatic situation that required careful handling. Publicly acknowledging his unofficial visit would raise uncomfortable questions about why he had entered France secretly. Ignoring a direct request for a meeting from a head of state would be diplomatically problematic, especially given France's official commitment to maintaining positive relationships with its former African colonies. After hours of behind-the-scenes consultation involving multiple government ministries, the Élysée Palace, and France's intelligence services, a response finally came through diplomatic channels. French President Marcel Fournier greeted him in a private study with diplomatic cordiality that couldn't quite mask his confusion and underlying concern. At 61, Fournier was a seasoned politician who had navigated numerous international crises, but the circumstances of this meeting were unprecedented in his experience. President Traoré, he said, gesturing to leather chairs arranged around a small conference table, "This is certainly an unexpected pleasure. Your presence in Paris without official notification is highly unusual, though, of course, we're always honored to host fellow heads of state. Some matters require discretion before they can become subjects of official diplomacy," Traoré replied, accepting the offered seat while noting the subtle signs of nervousness in his host's demeanor. Fournier poured coffee from an elegant service, a gesture that seemed designed to normalize what was clearly an abnormal situation. "And what matter brings you to Paris so urgently and discreetly?" 40 tons of gold, President Fournier, removed from my country in the days immediately before independence in 1960. The effect was immediate and telling. Fournier's hand paused momentarily as he set down his coffee cup, and a slight tension appeared in his shoulders despite his efforts to maintain diplomatic composure. "These are quite a significant claim about events that occurred more than 60 years ago," Fournier said carefully. "Historical questions from the colonial period are often complex and require careful interpretation of limited records." "Not a claim," Traoré said calmly, opening the folder to reveal copies of Mercier's colonial records, journal entries, and the photographs of the gold removal. "A documented fact, preserved by one of your own colonial administrator who came to recognize the operation as theft." Fournier examined the documents with the practiced neutrality of an experienced politician accustomed to reviewing sensitive materials. His eyes moved methodically across the pages, taking in the damning evidence while his expression remained carefully controlled. "These appear to be colonial administrative records," he said after several minutes of review. "Historical documents certainly provide important insights into past events, but drawing modern legal conclusions requires understanding the complex legal frameworks and international contexts of that era." "The context is quite clear," Traore replied with measured firmness. "Gold that rightfully belonged to the people of Burkina Faso was systematically removed without consent, notification, or compensation. That gold, valued at approximately 2.3 billion euros at current market prices, has been held in French national reserves over 6 decades. Fournier leaned back slightly, his diplomatic training evident in his careful response. "Even if these events occurred exactly as you describe, and I'm not disputing the document's authenticity, there are extraordinarily complex questions of historical jurisdiction, colonial-era legal frameworks, and various statutes of limitation that would apply to such claims." "I anticipated that response," Traore said, producing the final document from his folder, the detailed architectural plan of the French gold storage facility with its classified annotations. "These are clearly not historical documents but contemporary intelligence. Where did you obtain this?" he demanded, his voice carrying the first hint of genuine alarm. "From the same French colonial administrator who documented the gold removal and spent the remainder of his life attempting to atone for his participation in it. Jean-Baptiste Mercier was remarkably thorough in preserving evidence, including detailed information about where colonial gold was stored and how it could be identified and recovered." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Traore had demonstrated not only historical evidence of gold theft, but current intelligence about one of France's most sensitive facilities. The combination transformed this from a historical dispute into a contemporary security and diplomatic crisis. "What exactly are you proposing, President Traoré?" Fournier asked finally, his tone now reflecting the gravity of the situation. "Justice, not confrontation. The return of what was taken, through a process that allows both our nations to move forward with dignity. This evidence could be presented to international courts or released publicly, creating a diplomatic and legal crisis that would benefit neither of us. Alternatively, we can address this historical wrong directly, government to government." Fournier studied him carefully, clearly calculating the political and diplomatic implications. "You understand that acknowledging such a claim could potentially open France to similar demands from other former African colonies." "Perhaps that conversation is overdue," Traore suggested diplomatically. "However, each case would require specific evidence as detailed and comprehensive as what I've presented here. I'm not seeking to create a legal precedent that could be applied universally. I'm seeking to resolve a specific, well-documented historical injustice against my nation." What followed was nearly 6 hours of intensive negotiation, as additional French officials were discreetly brought into the increasingly complex discussion. Legal experts specializing in international law, financial advisors familiar with gold markets and reserve management, and diplomatic strategists all contributed to a conversation that had no precedent in modern international relations. The challenge was finding a framework that would satisfy Burkina Faso's legitimate claim for justice while avoiding diplomatic chaos that could destabilize Franco-African relations across the continent. Traditional legal remedies seemed inadequate for addressing such a unique historical grievance. By midnight, with both leaders showing signs of exhaustion from hours of intense discussion, the outlines of an unprecedented agreement began to emerge. France would not directly acknowledge theft, a term that carried too many legal and diplomatic complications, but would establish a historical reconciliation and development fund, specifically for Burkina Faso. This fund would be capitalized with gold transfers equivalent to the amount documented in Mercier's evidence, adjusted for 60 years of inflation and reasonable interest calculations. The transfers would occur in phases over 3 years, allowing both nations to manage the political and economic implications carefully. The agreement would be structured as a voluntary recognition of historical complexity rather than legal restitution for theft. France would emphasize its commitment to addressing colonial-era legacies through cooperative development rather than being compelled to pay reparations for criminal activity. In exchange, Burkina Faso would commit to transparent, accountable use of the transferred funds for genuine national development, with joint Franco-Burkinabe oversight of major projects. All evidence gathered by Traore would remain confidential, with original documents preserved in a newly established historical archive accessible to authorized scholars from both nations. As the marathon negotiation session concluded in the early hours of the morning, President Fournier asked the question that had undoubtedly been troubling him throughout their discussions. How did you discover this evidence after so many decades? According to the documents, Mercier's revelation was programmed to remain sealed until 2025. Traore acknowledged the mystery that had puzzled him as well. That remains unexplained. Someone accelerated Mercier's timeline, sending me the notification 5 years early. I still don't know the identity of that person or their motivation for acting now rather than waiting for the originally planned date. Fournier nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps some debts are not entirely historical. There may be contemporary actors who believe justice has been delayed long enough. As Traore left the Élysée Palace, the first light of dawn was breaking over Paris. Within hours, he would be returning to Burkina Faso, carrying not physical gold, that would come later, but something perhaps more valuable, a formal commitment to historical justice and the resources necessary to transform his nation's development trajectory. The journey back to Ouagadougou was marked by careful silence and cautious optimism. No public announcements were made, no hints given about the momentous agreement taking shape between the two nations. Traoré spent the flight time preparing for the complex work ahead, turning a diplomatic breakthrough into concrete development outcomes for his people. Upon his return, he gathered his closest advisors in the secure conference room where this extraordinary journey had begun just days earlier. The transformation in their circumstances was remarkable. They had entered this crisis with a mysterious photograph and vague suspicions, and emerged with documented evidence of historical theft and a framework for recovering national stolen wealth. "We've achieved something unprecedented," Traoré told his team as he briefed them on the Paris negotiations. Not just the recovery of stolen resources, but formal acknowledgement, however carefully phrased, of historical wrongs that have shaped our nation's development trajectory for 60 decades. Finance Minister Ouedraogo was already analyzing the economic implications. 2.3 billion euros transferred over 3 years will fundamentally alter our development capacity. We can finally fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure projects at the scale our people deserve, using resources that rightfully belong to us all along. But even as they celebrated this diplomatic victory, the mystery of the accelerated timeline continued to puzzle them. Someone had triggered Mercier's evidence 5 years ahead of schedule, and understanding that person's identity and motivation remained important for fully grasping the situation. The answer came 3 months later as legal teams from both nations worked to finalize the complex agreement. Security Chief Ouedraogo's patient investigation had eventually traced the envelope's delivery through a network of contacts that led to a surprising revelation. Jean-Baptiste Mercier had died in 1998 after decades of quiet philanthropic work in rural Burkina Faso, funding schools and medical clinics through a private foundation. His only child, Marie Mercier, had continued his educational and healthcare initiatives while gradually learning the full extent of his father's colonial-era documentation and evidence preservation. When terminal cancer was diagnosed in early 2020, Marie had made the decision to activate her father's contingency plan ahead of schedule. Rather than waiting for the automated 2025 timeline, she had arranged for immediate notification to ensure she would live to see whether her father's carefully preserved evidence would lead to justice or simply create diplomatic complications without meaningful resolution. This revelation added profound human dimension to their success. The recovery of Burkina Faso's stolen gold represented not just national vindication, but the completion of a family's multi-generational commitment to historical justice. 6 months after Traoré's clandestine visit to Paris, a formal ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to announce the establishment of the Franco-Burkinabe Historical Reconciliation and Development Fund. The carefully worded joint statement emphasized addressing historical imbalances and recognizing the complex legacy of the colonial era without explicitly acknowledging theft or criminal activity. But the substance of the agreement was unmistakable. Gold valued at 2.3 billion euros would be transferred to Burkina Faso over 3 years, with the first shipment of 10 tons arriving on the day of the public announcement. In a private moment before the public ceremony, Traoré visited the small foundation established by the Mercier family in a rural area outside Ouagadougou. The modest clinic and school had operated quietly for decades, funded first by Jean-Baptiste's private resources and later by Marie's continued commitment to her father's vision of service. A simple plaque on the school's main building bore an inscription that now carried new meaning: "In service of a debt that cannot be fully repaid." Traoré arranged for a second plaque to be installed beneath the original. Some debts are inherited, some are chosen. Both have the power to heal. But even as Burkina Faso celebrated this historic victory, another mysterious envelope was making its way through postal systems toward Ouagadougou. This time, it contained evidence that would prove the stolen gold was merely the beginning of a much larger pattern of colonial and post-colonial resource manipulation. 3 months after the first gold transfer arrived in Ouagadougou, as construction began on new schools and hospitals funded by the recovered resources, President Traoré received another unmarked envelope. The familiar handwriting and discreet delivery method immediately captured his attention, though the sender of the previous revelation had been revealed to be Marie Mercier, now deceased. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note in the same distinctive script as the original message, though analysis would later reveal it had been written by a different person attempting to replicate the previous style. The gold was only the beginning. Marie entrusted me with one final revelation before her death. The evidence on this drive exposes Operation Crocodile, the systematic misdirection of geological surveys across Francophone Africa from 1960 to 1985. What colonial and post-colonial surveyors found and what they reported to newly independent African governments were deliberately different. Coordinates enclosed. 48 hours before others received this same information. The debt continues to unravel. Security Chief Ouedraogo's immediate analysis of the USB drive revealed hundreds of classified documents from French geological survey missions conducted across former colonies during the first 25 years after independence. Most significantly, it contained evidence of a coordinated program to provide newly independent African nations with incomplete or deliberately misleading geological assessments. The documents revealed that accurate surveys identifying significant mineral deposits, particularly resources that weren't commercially valuable in the 1960s but became crucial later, were conducted but not shared with African governments. Instead, simplified reports omitting critical findings were provided to maintain French corporate and governmental advantages in resource exploitation negotiations. If this documentation is authentic, Professor Traoré said during an emergency briefing, it means virtually every geological survey conducted in Francophone Africa during this period potentially understated or completely omitted critical mineral deposits. Finance Minister Ouedraogo added the crucial economic context, particularly resources like rare earth elements, lithium, and other materials that weren't considered strategically important in the 1960s but are now essential for renewable energy and digital technologies. The coordinates included in the message pointed to locations across 5 West African nations, all former French colonies. Each location apparently corresponded to significant resource deposits that had been identified but deliberately omitted from official reports provided to African governments. Most remarkably, the first set of coordinates matched exactly with locations where Burkina Faso's own recent geological surveys had identified promising mineral deposits. Resources that their scientists had discovered in 2020 had apparently been documented by French surveyors 60 years earlier, then deliberately hidden. The implications were staggering. Beyond Burkina Faso, this suggested that Niger, Mali, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire might all possess significant undocumented mineral wealth, resources that could transform their development trajectories just as the recovered gold was transforming Burkina Faso. But the 48-hour deadline created immediate urgency. Intelligence sources were already reporting unusual activity at major international mining corporations with interests in West Africa. Executives were being recalled from vacations, technical teams were being mobilized, and legal departments were working overtime. Someone has leaked information about massive rare earth deposits in the region, Security Chief Ouedraogo reported. Not the specific locations, but enough to trigger a corporate scramble. Within days, these companies will be approaching all regional governments with proposals, creating competitive pressure where nations might make hasty decisions without complete information about their own resources. Traoré made a decision that would prove historically significant. Rather than pursuing narrow national advantage with this information, he contacted the presidents of the 4 other nations identified in the documents, requesting emergency secure communications to share the evidence and coordinate their response. We have 48 hours before international mining corporations begin approaching each of us with proposals based on information they've possessed for decades while we remained ignorant. I propose we use this time to coordinate our response rather than compete against each other. The concept he outlined was unprecedented in African diplomacy. A unified regional approach to resource development based on shared technical assessment, coordinated negotiation positions, and mutual support in dealing with international mining interests. Burkina Faso's experience with recovering our stolen gold has demonstrated the power of negotiating from positions of knowledge and strength, Traoré explained. Imagine that leverage multiplied across our 5 nations, with comprehensive understanding of our collective resource wealth. The response from his fellow presidents was cautious but increasingly interested as they reviewed the evidence Traoré shared. Decades of regional competition, varying political alignments, and different relationships with former colonial powers had created natural barriers to such cooperation. However, the documentation of systematic geological survey manipulation was compelling, and each leader recognized the strategic advantage of coordinated action over individual competition for foreign investment. Within 24 hours, all four presidents had agreed to send technical and ministerial representatives to an emergency summit in Ouagadougou. The meeting would focus on validating the new evidence, assessing each nation's true resource wealth, and developing a unified approach to international negotiations. As preparations for this historic summit proceeded, Traoré received an unexpected call from French President Fournier requesting urgent consultation regarding potentially destabilizing information circulating regarding historical geological surveys in West Africa. President Traoré, Fournier said during their secure video conference, "I've been briefed about concerning rumors regarding resource assessments in your region. I want to be clear that any historical discrepancies in geological reporting would have occurred under previous administrations with different transparency standards." The parallel to their previous discussions about the stolen gold was obvious. France was again attempting to distance itself from current leadership while positioning itself advantageously for whatever revelations might emerge. Just as the gold removal occurred under previous administrations, yet we found a constructive path forward that addressed historical wrongs while building stronger bilateral relations. "Precisely my hope," Fournier replied. "France would like to offer comprehensive technical assistance in validating any new resource discoveries, along with development partnerships that reflect modern standards of equity and transparency." Traoré understood the diplomatic subtext clearly. France was attempting to preemptively manage the situation by positioning itself as a helpful partner rather than a defensive party once the geological manipulation became public knowledge. Just as the gold removal occurred under previous administrations, yet we found a constructive path forward that addressed historical wrongs while building stronger bilateral relations. "Precisely my hope," Fournier replied. "France would like to offer comprehensive technical assistance in validating any new resource discoveries, along with development partnerships that reflect modern standards of equity and transparency." The emergency summit exceeded all expectations. Despite historical rivalries and differing political systems, the five West African leaders quickly found common ground when confronted with evidence of systematic resource information manipulation spanning 2.5 decades. Technical teams compared the newly revealed historical surveys with recent geological assessments conducted by their own scientists, confirming the accuracy and significance of the hidden documentation. The pattern was consistent across all 5 countries. Critical strategic minerals had been systematically omitted from reports provided to African governments, while detailed information was maintained by French institutions. This wasn't simple information asymmetry or administrative oversight, Niger's Minister of Mines concluded after reviewing comparative data. This was deliberate resource control, designed to maintain French advantages in negotiations for decades after formal colonization ended. By the summit's conclusion, an unprecedented agreement had emerged: the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance. Its founding principles included shared technical assessment of newly identified resource deposits, coordinated negotiations with international mining interests, regional development of processing capacity to ensure value addition remained within Africa, and transparency mechanisms modeled on Burkina Faso's gold recovery framework. Most significantly, the alliance established minimum standards for any future resource development agreements, majority local ownership requirements, mandatory technology transfer provisions, environmental protection standards, and direct linkage between resource extraction and measurable development outcomes for local populations. The alliance's immediate impact was both dramatic and far-reaching. When international mining executives arrived in West Africa with their hastily prepared proposals, they encountered not individual nations eager for investment at any cost, but a coordinated alliance with comprehensive knowledge of regional resource wealth and unprecedented leverage in negotiations. Within weeks, news of Operation Crocodile's exposure had spread beyond the 5 founding alliance members. Other African nations began conducting their own investigations into historical geological surveys, questioning decades of assumptions about their mineral wealth and resource development potential. The revelation that systematic geological information manipulation had been standard practice during the early post-independence period prompted broader questions about other forms of subtle economic control exercised by former colonial powers. For President Traoré, this second phase of revelation represented something even more significant than Burkina Faso's gold recovery. While the repatriated wealth had transformed his nation's development trajectory, the geological survey exposures were transforming the entire paradigm of resource governance across the region. 3 months after the alliance's formation, the 5 leaders reconvened in Ouagadougou to sign formal treaties establishing their cooperative framework. The ceremony was held at the museum documenting Burkina Faso's gold recovery, with a new wing dedicated to Operation Crocodile and its exposure. In his address to the gathering, Traoré acknowledged the source of both revelations. None of this transformation would have been possible without the moral courage of Jean-Baptiste Mercier, who documented the gold theft, and his daughter, Marie, who ensured that broader patterns of resource manipulation would also be revealed. He continued, "Their actions remind us that historical justice often depends on individual conscience transcending institutional loyalty. But equally important, it depends on leaders willing to act on inconvenient truths rather than ignoring them for short-term diplomatic convenience." The ceremony concluded with the signing of formal cooperation agreements that established the alliance as a permanent institution for coordinating resource governance across member nations. Technical cooperation protocols, shared negotiation frameworks, and joint oversight mechanisms were formalized in documents that represented a fundamental shift in how African nations approached their natural resource wealth. 1 year after the alliance's formation, its impact had extended far beyond West Africa. The model of regional resource cooperation based on comprehensive geological knowledge and coordinated international negotiations had inspired similar initiatives in other parts of the continent and beyond. Several Latin American nations had adopted comparable approaches to their own resource development, emphasizing regional cooperation over competition for foreign investment. Indigenous communities in North America and Australia cited the West African model in their negotiations with extraction companies and national governments. Most significantly, the alliance had fundamentally altered the dynamics of resource negotiations globally. International mining corporations could no longer exploit information asymmetries or play African nations against each other in competitive bidding for resource extraction rights. The establishment of the Pan-African Geological Data Repository in Ouagadougou, a secure facility housing comprehensive resource surveys conducted by African scientists, ensured that knowledge about the continent's mineral wealth could never again be manipulated or hidden from its people. President Traoré, now recognized internationally as a pioneer in resource sovereignty, was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly on the transformation that had begun with 40 tons of stolen gold and evolved into a continent-wide reassessment of resource governance. "What we have learned," he told the Global Assembly, "is that genuine independence requires not just political sovereignty, but resource sovereignty. Not just control over territory, but comprehensive knowledge about what lies beneath it. And not just knowledge, but the institutional capacity to ensure that natural wealth serves national development rather than external exploitation." 5 years after receiving the mysterious envelope that began this transformation, President Traoré stood in the expanded Mercier Foundation complex in rural Burkina Faso. What had started as a small school and clinic funded by a repentant colonial administrator had grown into a regional center for education, healthcare, and resource governance training. Pierre Mercier, Jean-Baptiste's grandson, had relocated from Canada to serve as the foundation's director, completing a family journey that had spanned 3 generations and 2 continents. Under his leadership, the foundation had become a living memorial to the power of moral courage and intergenerational responsibility. "My grandfather could never have imagined this outcome," Pierre told Traoré as they walked through gardens maintained by local students. "From his documentation of colonial theft to continental transformation of resource governance." "Perhaps not the specific form," Traoré agreed, "but I believe he understood the transformative power of truth revealed at the right moment to people capable of acting on it. That's why he preserved the evidence so meticulously and arranged for its eventual disclosure." The Foundation's central building housed a comprehensive archive documenting both the historical theft of African resources and the contemporary movement to reclaim resource sovereignty. Researchers from around the world came to study how systematic colonial exploitation had been exposed and addressed through persistent investigation and strategic diplomacy. At the archive's heart was a simple display containing the original photograph that had started Traoré's investigation, the golden key that had unlocked crucial evidence in Paris, and the first gold bar from the repatriated shipment. Beside these artifacts were portraits of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier, father and daughter whose moral courage had catalyzed transformation across a continent. 10 years after the mysterious envelope first arrived at his desk, President Traoré addressed the graduating class of the African Resource Governance Institute in Ouagadougou. The institute, built with proceeds from the recovered gold, had become the continent's premier center for training resource management professionals committed to transparent, sovereign development. 50 young men and women from 23 African nations had completed advanced training in geological assessment, environmental protection, economic analysis, and international negotiation. As he looked at these graduates, the future leaders of Africa's resource sector, Traoré reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "You enter your careers at a historic turning point," he told them. "For centuries, Africa's resources enriched others while our people remained impoverished. That pattern has been fundamentally broken, not through confrontation or isolation, but through knowledge, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to sovereignty." The evidence of transformation was visible across the continent. The Pan-African Resource Governance Framework now included 43 nations. Processing facilities ensured that raw materials were increasingly transformed into higher-value products within African borders. Strategic mineral reserves had given member nations significant influence in global markets, particularly for materials essential to renewable energy and digital technologies. Most importantly, transparent governance mechanisms guaranteed that resource wealth translated directly into educational advancement, healthcare improvement, and infrastructure development. The relationship between natural resource endowment and human development had been fundamentally transformed. After the graduation ceremony, Traore visited the Institute's Memorial Hall, where a comprehensive exhibition documented the journey from colonial resource extraction to sovereign development. At its center stood the original Swiss safety deposit box, the golden key from Paris, and the first gold bar from the repatriated shipment. Alongside these artifacts were portraits of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier, whose moral courage had triggered a cascading series of revelations that reshaped resource governance across a continent. Beneath their images was an inscription in multiple languages: "Truth revealed, justice pursued, legacy transformed." As evening fell over Ouagadougou, lights illuminated the transformed cityscape. Research facilities, educational institutions, healthcare centers, and infrastructure projects developed with resources that had been denied to previous generations. Similar transformation was visible across alliance member nations, creating a network of sovereign development that demonstrated Africa's capacity for self-determined progress. In his private office, Traore penned a letter to be placed in the Institute's time capsule scheduled for opening 50 years in the future. To those who read these words in 2075, the transformation you have inherited began with a simple act of conscience by a French colonial administrator who chose to document truth rather than participate in deception. From that seed grew the recovery of stolen wealth, the revelation of hidden knowledge, and ultimately a new model of resource governance. Our journey taught us that genuine independence requires comprehensive sovereignty, not just political control, but resource knowledge and economic self-determination. It demonstrated that transparency is not merely administrative virtue, but a transformative force that reshapes power relationships at their foundation. Most importantly, we learned that historical injustice, while it cannot be fully undone, can become the catalyst for creating more just systems for future generations. What was taken from us has been reclaimed not merely as compensation for past wrongs, but as foundation for possibilities we could barely imagine. May you who read these words have built wisely upon this foundation. May the sovereignty we reclaimed have created prosperity beyond our dreams, and may you remember that transformation often begins with a single act of conscience, amplified by those with vision to see justice where others see only limitations. From the past, justice; for the future, possibility. As Traore sealed the letter, he reflected on the mysterious message that had arrived a decade earlier and set in motion events no one could fully anticipate. What had begun as recovery of 40 tons of stolen gold had evolved into comprehensive reimagining of how Africa's resources could serve Africa's development. The golden legacy was complete, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of fulfillment. A circle of transformation that began with theft had culminated in sovereignty. What was taken in darkness had returned in light, illuminating not just Burkina Faso's past, but Africa's future. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou shimmered in the night, brighter and more evenly distributed than they had been a decade earlier. Similar transformation was spreading across the continent, as nations reclaimed not just their resources, but their resource futures. The debt that Jean-Baptiste Mercier had sought to repay could never be fully balanced, but his act of conscience, preserved by his daughter's determination and realized through visionary leadership, had created something more valuable than repayment, a new beginning founded on truth, justice, and the unwavering belief that Africa's wealth should serve Africa's people. The golden legacy was eternal. Fournier would meet privately with Traore that evening at the presidential palace, though the meeting would not appear on any official schedules. "They're scrambling to understand why I'm here and what I know," Traore told Security Chief Ouedraogo, as they prepared for what could be the most important diplomatic encounter in Burkina Faso's history. The Élysée Palace, with its opulent furnishings and historical grandeur, built partly through colonial exploitation, provided an ironically appropriate setting for a confrontation about historical justice. As Traore was escorted through ornate hallways lined with paintings and artifacts that represented centuries of French power, he carried with him not just Mercier's evidence, but the moral weight of 60 decades of injustice that had shaped his nation's development trajectory. French President Marcel